Welcome, everyone. This is a very special little event that we are doing where I am here at the Addison Historical Museum. My name is Courtney. I am one of the teen librarians at the Addison Public Library. My name tag is hiding. There we go. And I am here with...
I'm Susan English. I am the museum coordinator for the Village of Addison.
Yeah, thank you for having us. I'm really excited about this one. So just to give a little background of what we're going to be talking about today, several months ago, we had a patron come into the library and inquire about someone called the Corn Cob Man, which was something we had never heard about before. Surprisingly, there are some Addison residents who work at the Addison Public Library, but not a lot of them do. So we reached out to you, and you came back to us with some very interesting things, and that kind of sparked off this whole idea of learning more about who is the Corn Cob Man. And since this is, it kind of turned into like an urban legend, sort of like local cryptid type of like weird story that happened historically here. And we're going to be doing a murder mystery at the library this week, and the Corn Cob Man is absolutely making an appearance. Mind you, that part is all fictionalized. It is 100% fictionalized. I will, however, be using different stories and things that we're talking about here to sort of like introduce, like, here's the real story of things. And I also wanted to make this video so that we can distinctly put the difference between fiction and history as we have it. So I will say that a lot of what we're talking about today is hearsay and legend and such. There seems to be stories that are sort of like the urban legend. We were talking like a boogeyman type of a thing. I think we all kind of grew up like campouts or, scary stories and sleepovers and stuff like that. I think mine was the creepy babysitter story, where there was like a man who just like, it was a statue in their living room, and when the parents come home, the babysitter's like, I gotta tell you, that statue is really creepy. And they're like, what statue? Like, that one haunted me for years. So like, we've got that creepy urban story going on, but then we actually had somebody portraying themselves as the Corn Cob Man, and it actually made it into the news bulletin, local newspaper, which we've got clippings of, and we'll be able to show you that too. So I guess let's get started with, how did you first come across the story of the Corn Cob Man? How was this brought to your aware?
Well, here at the Historical Museum, we receive inquiries from the public on different topics. Can't remember if the person emailed or called, but he contacted us and said, what do you have in your files about the Corn Cob Man? Okay. So I went to our trusty file cabinet and I came up with nothing. And I'm like, okay, this is interesting. So from the details that gentleman gave me in terms of the time that he remembered the Corn Cob Man, I was able to consult our newspaper collection. And sure enough, I hit pay dirt and I found 2 instances in the Addison News Bulletin where he's mentioned very prominently.
Yeah, no kidding. Yes. We will show it to you later when we get into the descriptions and stuff, but there's a full illustration. So it's very, very fun. Yes. I am really looking forward to this. So off of the top of the hat. So what I have done, between the two of us, we have come up with some pretty good stuff. What I have done is, by your suggestion, I joined a Facebook group called When You Know You're From Addison When, which was a phenomenal Facebook group to be invited into. And I asked them about the Corn Cob Man. And in return, I have many stories. And I also looked through their archives and I found stories pretty much dating all the way back from like 2010 when people were talking about this. So I have stories from the past, on more years than I actually want to think about because I was alive during all those times, and doing things. So I have stories across the board, and I'll be sharing different stories that I kind of compiled on them. I am going to be avoiding certain names But at the very end of this, I will have a thank you to everybody that I kind of pulled information from, as well as, thank you to you. And thank you to whoever drew that. That's amazing. So I guess my first question is, do you know anything about specifically like the legend, the boogie story of the Corn Cob Man?
As I said, really, I didn't know anything about it till I had gotten that research request. So I went to the original source in the newspaper.
Right.
Because, you expect your newspaper to be the source of your information. I know there's a lot of fake news these days, but back in the 1964,
that was when it happened.
Our newspapers were much more credible. And in fact, there was because of the coverage of the Corn Cob Man, there was a disagreement between the editor and the editor-in-chief whether to run the story and to run the actual drawing of the Corn Cob Man. The editor-in-chief went out. He wanted to put that in, but the other editor who donated some of these resources to the museum claims that he was against it, and he felt that it hurt the paper down the long run with their circulation, because people no longer saw them as a credible source.
Ooh, very interesting.
Yes. So that kind of piqued my interest. So anytime that it's, come up or whatever, I've kind of latched on to hear more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a brief overview. The Corn Cob Man, also known as the Human Unicorn, and I think he had like a series of other names like the Corn Cob Monster and such. There's an urban legend about him that was very similar to like the boogeyman type of stories. And I've got several stories. They're a little bit different. But one person says it was just an urban legend that kids would tell to freak each other out. I remember hearing about him back in the 60s and had a friend with an older sister that said that the story had been around since her childhood. Addison was very different back in the day, and there were still small farms around with cornfields here and there throughout the town and around the edges. There were many versions of the story depending on which neighborhood that you lived in. So, Addison right now, we've got lots of businesses, lots of homes, we have a massive industrial park. But in the 60s, supposedly, significantly different.
Well, in 1950, the population was still under 1,000. It's not until after World War II, when farmers start selling their land to developers, that you get the first subdivisions being built here in Addison.
Yeah.
So yes, it was a very rural, very German, Lutheran town.
Right.
Back in the 50s. Now, between 1960 and 1970, the population quadrupled because of all these subdivisions being built.
Right.
And that's when they built all the schools in Addison School District 4 to accommodate all the families with their children.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've still got farms around. It's wild to me, personally, to think that, like, here it's so very suburban, but it was very rural. But that's how development works. So we have more farms are around, so that's a really good setting of the scene. And also, like, people are out and about a lot more at this time too. They're walking around, kids are on bikes, people are outside all the time. We're not so much worried about, like, where are your kids all the time, because it's just a safer environment.
Oh yeah, you could go outside and play. Your parents weren't concerned about you being outside at all. Right. And your neighbors looked after your kids too. So.
Yeah, a lot of community helping there too. So now we're getting into the spookies. So the stories that we heard were pretty good. This is somebody else speaking. The Corn Cob Man was so these are like the legends. So the spooky, scary stories. The Corn Cob Man was a simple farmer who worked his fields diligently until one day when he had an accident with some farm equipment. Seems he was working on the tractor with a cutter, plowing the fields, but the tractor got stuck in the mud. He got off to try and free the tractor, and somehow it lunged forward with the cutter slicing his head wide open. It left him brain damaged, and his own family was so scared of him that he had to sleep in the barn. He stuffed corn cobs in his own clothing to try and keep warm, and in the winter, and as the barn was unheated. It was a very lonely existence, so he craved company, and he never had any, so he took it upon himself to grab a child that might wander into the land close enough for him to snatch. Those children were never found again. Of course, most of this is made up, but it made for a good storytelling at the Cub Scout sleepovers.
Yeah, but there were a lot of accidents on the farm.
Yeah.
So they're tying into that fear of accidents on the farm. We have documented cases of people losing a limb.
Oh, yeah.
And such from some of the manual farm equipment that they were using back in those days.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
So viable.
Yes.
But also very scary. Somebody else says, there was a lot of Corn Cob Man stories. I lived across the street from the farm, and the story was that the farmer got mad at the person and rammed a cob through his skull. So a little bit different there. A little bit more deranged. And then finally another says that years ago, before they built up at the Addison Stone Mill Road, before they built up Addison, Stone Mill Road was all trees, brush, and very scary at night. Well, the story goes that an old man used to live back there, and if he caught you trespassing, he would come after you. And if he caught you, you would disappear. He was dressed in overalls and smoked a corncob pipe, and that's how it was told back in the 70s. So the story is a little bit shifting.
There's also trespassing stories, too.
Yep.
If you trespass on somebody's property, that's very common, not just in Addison, but any community.
Right. Mm-hmm. And also, these are also stories to, warn your kids away from going where you shouldn't be going. Which that would have worked for me.
Me too. Very compliant. Yeah.
I would have been a massive chicken. I would have been so scared to go past any fields. And later on, we'll go into people's reactions on things, and that's a common thing for sure. Okay, now on to the part where the information that you found. So it turns out that in 1964, there was an individual who would dress up and jump out and scare people and sort of caused a whole hullabaloo and alarming people. It got into the newspaper. There's many, many stories. I don't remember how long ago it was. I'm upset if it's over 10 years ago now. But do you remember when people were dressing up as clowns?
Oh, it's been a long time since clowns have been the new villain of the. I think it's specific some of the movies that were coming out at that particular time. Yeah.
Yeah, mm-hmm. If you don't remember, I distinctly do, because it was very weird. But people would dress up in clowns, and then they would just stand outside and be creepy. Yeah. But it wasn't just one person; it was like many people, and like across the country, I believe. But it was very strange and very odd, but also harmless. People were just being weird and creepy and making it sort of viral. So this was an individual who was doing this. Let's see. So this is actually a story. This was a description from somebody. I actually found this on Reddit. Oh, wow. I managed to find a Reddit story about this. So this person said, I grew up in unincorporated Addison near Army Trail in 53. I was going into 3rd grade that summer, and the Corn Cob Man was big news. We were surrounded by cornfields back then. The Addison Press had a full-sized front page illustration of him. I'll show you in a moment. He wore a white sheet tied with a rope, had a knife, had a corn cob stuck on each side of his head and one on his forehead, and he would hide in trees and jump out at people, would jump out of cornfields and scare teenagers. The newspaper had stories each week of places that he was seen. One time, they almost caught him by the Addison pool, but he got away. It lasted all summer. There were no backyard tent sleepovers that summer. I think he was finally caught near Louis' restaurant in Addison. I was 8 years old, and we had a real boogeyman, the Corn Cob Man. And he says that the date was probably 1965, but we've got newspapers where it says 64. So that's, who knows how much of that is like their remembering on things. But we do actually have a newspaper clipping that he was referencing. And I think we can be tricky with this, and I'll be able to show you. Haha, there we go. One moment, please. We're going to do this. Yeah. All right, so flipping around. So here is the Addison News Bulletin. This is the local newspaper at the time. And as you can see, we are going from August 5th, 1964. So it was summer. Mm-hmm. And then the Wanted, the Human Unicorn, and there's our illustration, which is pretty amazing, actually. So this was the illustration that had a lot of contention with it, right?
Yes, definitely.
So he's got, it looks like the corn cob on there. Not very descript on facial features or anything like that.
Well, I don't think there ever were. People mention the corn cob is the defining element for him, yes.
Yeah, and that by itself is a pretty big thing. I'm really curious, how did he manage to get the corn cob? There we go. We're working again. Okay. How did he manage to get the corn cobs attached to his head? I want to know.
Not quite sure.
Yeah.
And then in the following issue, they talk about the Addison monster still free.
Oh, yeah, and then, there we go.
And someone in Itasca claims to have seen him.
Right, I was looking at this one too. So yeah, this story just keeps on trolling in.
And then the actual newspaper makes a plea.
Oh, right.
To the monster.
To the monster, which I think is absolutely amazing. I love that it starts with Dear Mo.
To cut it out. He's scaring kids.
Yeah. And like, what is that last line? To put it in a few choice words, you have become an unfunny problem to too many people, so why not call it quits? I absolutely love the tone of that. I think it's so funny. But also it shows how much the people were just so sick to death of this whole entire thing.
Well, I guess it had been really going on most of the summer, and finally the newspaper felt that they needed to address it, right?
And they sure did. So good for them. There's several stories of him being in the newspaper. Another says, I remember the Corn Cob Man. There was a sketch of him on the front page of the paper, as we saw. The sketch showed a corn cob attached to his forehead. He jumped out of trees to scare women. Very bizarre. We were petrified. I also remember being at the swimming pool, and supposedly the police caught him at the bowling alley across the street, and we all had to go into the locker rooms. Weird. And that was somebody who actually posted
now
that
that's
this
the
year.
Swimming pool that used to be near where, the bowling alley. So south of Fullerton.
Right.
They're not referencing the pool that was at Community Park.
Oh,
okay.
Thank you for that distinction. Mm-hmm. I do remember the one that was over there. That closed several years ago, I think.
Yeah, that was built, in the 70s.
Okay.
And then closed, several years ago. But this one was south of Fullerton.
Okay.
Closer to the bowling alley.
Where Stardust Bowl is?
Starbust, yeah.
Okay, so is Stardust the same bowling alley?
Yeah, Stardust is the same bowling alley. It has had different names over time.
Right.
We do have in our files when they built the one nearby the Stardust, they were raising monies to build the pool, and we have kind of the prospectus in our files here at the museum.
Ooh, very neat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All of these things are also viewable.
To come to the archives, they need an appointment.
Yes, you do need an appointment.
Yeah. You can see the museum on regular hours, but to see things that are in our file cabinets upstairs, you do need an appointment.
Right. And I mean, I'm learning a lot right now, so I'm having a grand time. So I guess that's a good point to kind of transition into the location of where he was. So the interesting thing when I was kind of like pulling out wherever he showed up, it's really hard to tell which ones were the urban legend locations and which ones were the individual, so the unicorn locations. So a lot of them, I think that kind of attribute to our unicorn is that he was found around Cherokee Park. Are you familiar where that one might be?
Yeah, that's east of Addison Road, in one of the older neighborhoods of Addison.
Is that still there?
Yeah, it's still there.
Ooh,
mm-hmm.
that's fun. Yeah, so somebody says he would occasionally hang around Cherokee Park in the late evening, so we would avoid that park after the 6 p.m. fire whistle sounded. I am not familiar with the 6 p.m. fire whistle, are you?
I'm not. I'm wondering if some sort of curfew or something. But Cherokee Park would not be too far from Lake Street, south of Lake Street, and that's where the fire department used to have their station on Lake Street.
I think that's probably what it's referring to. I think I read something else where that sort of was referenced vaguely as well. So my guess is that they had a whistle that sounded every night at 6 o'clock. And frankly, if I was a kid, my mom would probably be like, you hear that whistle, you get your butt home. You have 5 minutes, you know. So yeah, I bet that's a good curfew time for a lot of kids to get home.
Well, it's probably getting dark at certain types of the year.
That is true. Definitely in the winter time, it would be getting that kind of dark. But also, if you've got this thing running around scaring people, you're probably going to want to make sure that your kids are home solid before dark. And also that's around dinner time too. So, so a lot of Cherokee Park, a lot of references to Louis Field, which I think later becomes Louis' Restaurant. I really don't know.
Louis' Restaurant was built in 1918.
Okay.
It's now Louis Reservoir because in 1987 we had the master flood here in Addison.
Oh.
And FEMA said certain businesses and homes could not rebuild where they were, and that Addison had to put in some safeguards against future flooding of Salt Creek.
That makes sense. So where is that located?
That's at Villa Avenue and Lake Street. So that's on the very eastern edge of Addison. As you're coming west on Route 20 towards Addison.
Yeah.
It's that major intersection. And on your left, you'll see it has aerators in their reservoirs there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They just got new ones.
Yeah, that light up, I hear. Yes, I
very
haven't seen
fancy.
them yet, but I hear they light up.
They have the big one in the middle, and then they've got 4 that like kind of spin, and they light. They're really cool. Yeah. They did that like less than a month ago, I think.
I saw on Facebook that they were doing that.
Yeah, it's nice. It's very nice. That does make sense because there's that little field right there that's empty, right along Salt Creek, and you can always tell when it's rained a lot because it floods right there. Interesting.
It's always flooded along Salt Creek.
Along all of Salt Creek.
All of Salt Creek. It's a perpetual. And as we've become more developed, it's gotten even worse.
Yeah.
The situation.
I went to Elk Grove High School, and Salt Creek runs along right back. Yeah. Always. No matter where Salt Creek is, it is flooded. All right, so other stories put him on Stone Mill Road and Lalonda and Wrightwood. So I think a lot of these are, and like, there was a barn. So, and an abandoned farm on Lake Street. So it could be a whole variety of like, well, those are sort of like the urban legend ones where you tell the story, you go, that one right there.
It's always a vacant building,
right?
Dilapidated. No one's been on the property for years. That sort of thing. Yes.
Yeah, nothing. Or he used to hang out on an empty farmhouse on Lalonde and Wrightwood. It was on the Wrightwood side. Nothing but fields and farm at the time. So very easy to get a little creeped out because, you know, who knows who's living there. So I guess let's get into what was the Corn Cob Man doing? So one person says, I lived by the 7-Eleven on Army Trail and was scared to death of the Corn Cob Man. We were told that he would go up to your bedroom windows, tap to get your attention, and scare you when you looked up. I swear that he came to my window and tapped several times. I never looked out. I froze in my bed. I was told that he lived across the street in the field behind the White House. And yes, he had a corn cob through his forehead from someone. Supposedly, someone drove it through his head in anger. This was back in the 70s. I had never seen him. I only fear him. Looking back, it's crazy to think that something like that could have existed. I love growing up in Addison. So this kind of feels like a little bit of a mix of like our unicorn and also the legend, like the urban story. And I would not be surprised if this person has a little brother or an older brother who like snuck around and tapped on their window.
Made him come to life right at your door. Yes.
My brothers would not have lost the opportunity.
Yes. Mine either.
100%. Somebody else says, back in the 60s, he had a corn cob coming from his forehead, and he would jump out of trees at night and scare people. He landed on our back porch one night, screaming through the screen door. My father chased him through several backyards, but never caught him. So that's fair. Sounds like someone is having a grand time being a little bit of a menace and just scaring people a lot. Someone says, the first and foremost, depending on where you lived, he was called Corn Cob Man or the Unicorn. And from what I was told at the time from somebody in the PD, he was finally caught. He had behavioral problems. No charges were brought against him. So you found a story about that, did you not?
One of our board members of the Addison Historical Society, Val Loftus, her father was Hubert Loftus, who was the village attorney, and he always claimed to his kids that he knew who the Corn Cob Man was, and that the village did bring him in for questioning and told him to knock it off, but they did not bring any charges against him.
Yeah. Now, I think it is that he never told anybody he didn't tell his kids who it was.
No.
Yeah, and I will say that through research, there were a couple of names that were kind of brought forward as, like, this is who it was. However, all of those are hearsay. There's nothing that we can find to confirm it. And
no definitive proof.
None at all. And honestly, I don't want to drag some innocent people's names through the mud or accuse them, even though the two individuals are supposedly long past by now, according also to hearsay. But I would rather not go into that. Mind you, we are going through a lot of like stories and such, but...
And this is not an invitation for anybody to reclaim the legend either.
That is true. We are having a grand time with just the mystery of it, yes. And it is very, very fun. And again, if you're at the Addison Public Library and you want to participate in the murder mystery, the Corn Cob Man will be revealed. It is false. It is purely fictionalized. And I am really excited. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. But it is fictionalized. And just for funsies. And it'll also be really obvious it's just for funsies. So, yeah, a lot of those stories kind of come and go. One person says, I got trapped at the Addison pool. They were closed because he was supposed to be at the bowling alley, which makes a lot more sense now to me that the bowling alley and the pool were right next to each other. Also, really nice to have a pool and a bowling alley right next to each other. That's a one-stop shop for, like, summertime fun. Somebody said he was real and he was caught. He jumped out of a tree one night in front of my older brother. The Corn Cob Man was screaming like crazy and took off running. He also jumped on our back porch and screamed. So another scream there. Somebody else was walking on Harvard at night and he jumped out and we ran to the nearest house and the police were called. Somebody says that the night that they caught the Corn Cob Man, this person and their brother were at the park and they had just left there and walked home, and 30 minutes later all the sirens were going crazy. And we found out later that the police were going after the guy. And they're like, that is cutting it way too close. A fun one is somebody who says, we could see him run across Cherokee Park at night from my bedroom window. One summer night, Art Hurley used his policed floodlight from the upstairs window and we saw him dashing across the park. He got caught a few times, but was just a goofy guy who painted his face white and stuck a part of a corn cob to his head. He scared the poop out of a few people, but never hurt anyone as far as I knew. And I think that's pretty consistent. I've not found a single thing where anybody was actually harmed. I think there were like a couple of things alluding to sort of a peeping Tom thing, but that also has not really gotten far at all. I don't think he
I
really
think his
was.
scare factor was enough.
Yeah.
Really.
I think this was somebody who just really enjoyed jumping out of trees.
And getting that initial reaction from folks.
That's right, yeah. People's reactions. There was somebody who said that I remember that it was great fun forming vigilante parties to hunt for him. So, and I think that was referenced in the memo to the monster or
Yeah, he
one
talks
of those.
about teen posses going after the Corn Cob Man.
Right. So anytime that the police were called, teen posses would not be far along behind with their dogs hunting out the Corn Cob Man. So apparently this person, jumped straight into that as well. I could absolutely see a bunch of teens running and, joining in on this kind of thing. Protect your community. And it would also be a lot of great fun. Dangerous, though, for the guy who is doing this. A little bit alarming.
Well, he must have been getting something personal out of it.
That is true.
Yeah.
One person said that we lived on South Wisconsin Avenue, and the old barn was down the street at the end of the dead-end street. 2 of the kids on the block came screaming down the street one day, saying that they were being chased by a unicorn. All the moms came out and tried questioning them, and they were adamant that they had seen a unicorn. Told them the unicorns were fictional, didn't matter, they stuck to their story. Now, more than 50 years later, mystery solved. It was this nutty guy who stuck corn cobs to his head and chased kids. So that probably was a bit early on, to the first happenings of this entire thing. But I thought what was really cool is this person saying, personally, whoever he was, I would like to thank him for a lasting, lifelong memory. Even though he scared quite a few people, you gotta admit, it was a fun time, and no real harm was done to anyone. So, that's the story of the Corn Cob Man. Do you have anything to add?
It's here in Addison, Illinois.
It sure is. Who knew that, a town like us, has just this weird little story. And frankly, it was a good time.
There's a lot of different stories about Addison, actually, that people don't know about. So
for sure. So if you're amenable to it, I would love to do this semi-regularly. Do you know of any other Addison spooky stories that we might be able to tap into?
I get asked that a lot because of Halloween. They want to know if our buildings are haunted.
That's right.
I do know that there was one of the teachers who lived in the Century House. His wife died.
Okay.
And they waked her out of the living room in the Century House. I've not felt any presence or anything of any otherworldly presence in any of the buildings.
But also waking people in the homes was common at certain points.
Oh, yes, definitely. Before, and a lot of people couldn't afford funeral homes.
Yeah.
So, you did it out of the house.
I mean, even now they're expensive.
Oh, yes. Definitely.
It's definitely a luxury to some degree. I think this would be a lot of fun to kind of come together and tell some lesser known stories about Addison and, just collaborate a little bit more. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, thank you for reaching out. We appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you for working with us, too. All right, well, I hope that you enjoyed this story. I would love to invite you, specifically if you're a teenager, to come and find out about our little murder mystery. This is a tradition that we do at the Addison Public Library every October. We kill my boss every year. Liz is our one head... I can't even talk anymore.
She's so scared she can't talk anymore. Yeah.
So she's out for a couple of days, and we always make her the victim because it's very fun. And the kiddos are every day. There's going to be new evidence. All of it fictionalized that I wrote. Not gonna lie, but there's clues every single day and leads you on this fun little merry chase, and maybe you'll be able to figure out who did it. I will say that the Corn Cob Man does make an appearance this time around, but it's just for funsies. So overall, hope you enjoyed this. Hope you learned something. I definitely learned something, and I feel like I know a little bit more about our community too. All right, good to go?
Good to go. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. See you next time. Bye.